Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller TV series named Jerusalem's Lot. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama unfolds in 1817 in a small Massachusetts town on a pitch-black night. A boy is jolted awake by noise and discovers his bearded father digging outside. Noticing the boy, the father drops his tools and moves to find him inside. The beardless mother, terrified, tries to stop the father, leading to a scuffle accompanied by some chicken screams. Worried about his mother, the boy hurries downstairs, only to see his bearded father choking her chick neck. The beardless mother desperately struggles and urges the boy to flee. Soon she breathes no more and dies to meet her maker. The father discards her body and turns a devilish gaze toward the boy, who runs upstairs in panic to hide in a trunk. After the father searches upstairs and finds nothing, he leaves in haste. The boy, hearing his father's departure, feels his fear slightly ease. But as he cautiously opens the trunk, he finds his father staring back at him with his messy beard in anger. The boy begs for mercy, but is dragged by his father into the prepared hole, pleading uninterruptedly, unable to comprehend why his kind father has gone mad suddenly, even seeking to end his family's lives. The father ignores his son's pleas, muttering about a blood debt to be paid, and strikes him with a shovel. The boy collapses instantly. As the father is about to bury the boy alive, a gunshot sounds, hitting his head but sparing his beard, causing the father to fall beside the boy. The savior is none other than the mother, who has awakened. Fast forward 33 years, the boy, now a man, has spent years at sea to escape his nightmarish childhood, becoming a captain known as Charles Boone. At this moment, he is aboard his ship, holding a funeral for his wife, who had been his companion for many years. Her final wish was for the captain to settle on land and provide a bright future for their 3 underage children. Afterward, he informs the children of the end of their wandering and the plan to settle on land. His eldest daughter and son accept their father's plan, while his youngest daughter, Loa, remains silent, touching the necklace her mother left her, her heart heavy with grief and remembrance. After a long journey, they arrived at a small town in Maine, where a Ferrari carriage pulled up to a stately old mansion. This wasn't Charles's home, yet he was about to become its master. It turned out that just recently, Charles had received a will from his late cousin, beckoning his family to come and inherit an old family house and a lumber mill. The matter perfectly aligned with his late wife's last wish, so Charles arrived with his family. However, what Charles didn't realize was that this moment marked the beginning of their nightmare. As the former caretaker handed over the keys and was about to leave, she made a point to earnestly caution Charles to always lock the cellar door and not to attempt uncovering its secrets. Charles was puzzled by her words. At that moment, a large flock of crows hastily flew over the house, and an eerie atmosphere quietly spread. But they didn't mind that too much. The family entered the mansion's great hall, where 5 portraits were displayed at the staircase. The children were curious, and Charles explained that the top left was his cousin, Stephen, the top right his uncle Philip, the center his grandmother, and the bottom left Stephen's daughter. He told the children that Stephen's entire family had passed away, which was why they were here. Then the children noticed the bottom right portrait of their father, which appeared to have been defaced. It seemed that not only this spot, but other areas of the house had been vandalized as well. Charles decided to report the matter to the local police the next day. Charles, being an old sea captain accustomed to rough waves and storms, naturally didn't take the old caretaker's words to heart. When he saw the cellar, he didn't hesitate to open it and walk in. The dim and decrepit cellar had what seemed to be fresh bloodstains on the floor, which reminded Charles of the caretaker's words. Stephen's daughter had died here, supposedly from an accidental fall down the stairs, and the sight of it purportedly led to Stephen's death from grief. Charles didn't dwell on it and continued further inside, where he found a large bathtub with shackles attached, seemingly for binding someone's hands and feet. Suddenly, a strange noise came from above, and Charles lifted his oil lamp. In the faint light, he saw a horrifying sight. The ceiling crevices were filled with squirming insects. In a moment of shock, a few fell onto Charles's face. Startled by the unexpected scene, he quickly left the cellar. The cellar led into the kitchen, and after coming out, Charles saw his children sitting down to eat. He warned them that no one was to enter the cellar. At night, Charles was soaking naked in the bathtub, squinting in delight, a clear sign that he was enjoying the moment. But in the next second, he was shocked to find worms coming out of the tub. Childhood nightmares of his father choking his mother flashed through his mind, and the harrowing memories caused him immense pain. Fortunately, the water in the bathtub quickly returned to normal. The oddities of the old family house deeply unsettled Charles. The following morning, the little boy was playing in the backyard when he suddenly stumbled upon 3 gravestones. He recognized the names on them instantly. They belonged to Steven's family. His cries of surprise attracted his 2 sisters and Charles to the scene. Charles was utterly astonished to find his cousin's family buried there. It made no sense at all. To keep the children from panicking, Charles reassured everyone, suggesting that perhaps this was Steven's family's way of showing their attachment to the old family house. Not far from the old house was the town center, bustling with people and full of life. Charles drove the children to town with the dual purpose of reporting the vandalism at the old house to the constable and allowing the children to relax and get a feel for the town. However, things were not as pleasant as they had hoped. After disembarking from the car, they found the townspeople unwelcoming, pointing fingers and muttering curses under their breath. Charles comforted his children, telling them not to be afraid, and encouraged them to look around while he headed to the constable's office. At the entrance, the assistant called out for Constable Dennison, who is also her husband. Dennison came out and recognized Charles on sight. After hearing Charles's story, Dennison seemed indifferent and instead spoke to Charles about his family's relations in the town. It turned out Steven's family was quite odd. Despite being wealthy, they had a poor relationship with the townspeople. Dennison ultimately advised Charles to sell the old house and the mill and leave this place of trouble. Still confused, Charles made it clear that he had no intention of leaving and wanted to put down roots and expand his family's presence. Seeing Charles's determination, Dennison simply wished him good luck, politely. As Charles looked at Dennison, he could not have imagined that this man, whether in the past or in the future, would have such a profound connection with the Boone family. Elsewhere, the 3 children were about to rejoin their father when the son noticed a furball. Just as he was about to pick it up to examine it, he looked up to see a weird girl approaching barefoot. It seems that this Gothic girl suffered from a strange illness. Her pale demeanor and ashen tone frightened the boy so much that he kept stepping back. In that critical moment, Charles arrived and promptly distanced his son from the Gothic girl. At this point, the Gothic girl's parents, hearing the commotion and seeing it was the newcomer Charles's family, angrily took the Gothic girl back into the house. Charles returned to the old homestead, bidding farewell to the former caretaker who had come to clean. Soon after, he was approached by a stranger. The woman's name was Rebecca, and she came to inquire if Charles was in need of a governess. She mentioned her education at a women's college and assured Charles that teaching 3 children would be no problem at all. Charles, who had been worried about his children's education, was immediately impressed by her credentials and eagerly told Rebecca that he would welcome her arrival. Not only was Charles's family in need of a teacher, but they were also short of a housekeeper. Charles was willing to offer Rebecca double the usual salary to take on both roles. After a thorough conversation with the children, and once Rebecca had left, Charles sought everyone's opinions. The show of hands made it clear to Charles that his children's education was finally in good hands. Loa remained silent, still grieving her mother's passing, but Charles reassured her that things would get better. He was determined to fulfill his late wife's wishes, to fully commit to the family business, and to build a strong network of contacts. While Charles was contemplating this, the walls began to creak and groan again. It was the 3rd night since his arrival, and this unsettling occurrence happened daily, giving Charles an ominous feeling. The next day, the workers went on a strike in the lumber miller. Charles walked into the lumber yard, calm and collected, and asked who the foreman was. A portly man with a swagger approached Charles to flex his big beard and extinguished his cigarette in his palm, which showed clearly that he was the ringleader of the workers. Charles, recognizing the foreman's contempt and tenacity, casually pulled out a coin. The foreman asked what it meant, and Charles replied it was severance pay. They could either take it and leave or produce 600 feet of lumber that day and continue to do so daily. Charles, who was used to giving orders at sea, offered them the choice. His words left all the workers stunned. Charles then declared his intentions to expand the lumber mill business and divide the profits into 100 shares, with the workers and foremen each getting 30% and himself another 30%. The more they chopped, the more they would earn. After hearing this, the workers exchanged glances, unsure what to make of it. Seeing that his proposal had made an impact, Charles turned to leave. At that moment, the bookkeeper hurriedly stopped him, eager to know his share. Charles explained that he would receive the remaining percentage and additional rewards if he performed well. The bookkeeper grinned at the news and then informed Charles that there were some outstanding invoices near Jerusalem's lot, far from there. Charles remembered that this was where his grandfather had started his fortune, and he decided to personally investigate the matter when he found the time. Meanwhile, inside the old mansion across the way, Rebecca had become one with the three siblings. She explained to them what Halloween was and taught them how to make props for the upcoming holiday. To get them into the festive spirit early, Rebecca played a seance game with the siblings. Holding a candle, she seriously set the mood. Suddenly, a gust of wind from outside inexplicably blew out the candle. Rebecca calmly walked to the window, muttering whether a spirit had truly arrived. Just as she was about to close it, a night owl crashed into the window and fell dead. The group, still unsettled, suddenly noticed that the cellar door had mysteriously opened, and from within came the sound of wailing. Rebecca quickly reassured everyone that it was just a game. Looking into the dark cellar, Rebecca's heart was filled with trepidation. In a panic, she quickly relocked the cellar and returned to her bedroom to furiously take notes. It turns out she was a writer. Her purpose in coming to the Boone family as a governess was intentional. When the Charles had arrived in town a few days earlier, she had an epiphany, thinking that the mysterious Boone family would make for an excellent story for her writing. So that's why she decided to delve into the Boone family to uncover their secrets. Before her arrival, Rebecca's mother had strongly discouraged her from getting involved with the Boone family, as many town residents had contracted strange illnesses rumored to be linked to the Charles, and the townspeople even posted a quarantine note on the Boone mansion. Undeterred, Rebecca told her mother that it was their legacy. It turns out that before leaving town, Rebecca's father had been the Boone family's lawyer in the past. The following Sunday, Charles accepted Rebecca's suggestion to attend church services. This, of course, was to help his family integrate into the town. However, as they were about to enter, the pastor's wife, Alice, stopped them. She told Charles that her father was the owner of the church and that entering required his consent. So Charles approached Alice's father, who spoke outrageously, telling the Boone family to get lost and claiming they were the curse of the town. Charles was furious and warned the old man that if he continued his rant, he would pay the price. Afterwards, Charles left with his children, his daughter Loa seemingly upset. Charles had no choice but to forcibly take her away. After the disheartening incident, Rebecca apologized to Charles, saying that the hatred was still rooted in the bizarre history of the Boone family's ancestors. Charles didn't blame her. Looking at Loa in the distance, he rushed to her side, apologetically saying that his behavior at the church had been too barbaric. Loa did not blame her father. She stood up and hugged her father. For the first time in a long while, she spoke up, asking if he had hidden something from them, and it scared her. Charles was stunned, realizing that the secrets he had been keeping might soon be exposed. In the town tavern, the foreman was proclaiming that the strange disease was all Charles's doing, and that their urgent priority was to drive them out of town. Encouraged by the crowd, the Gothic girl's father grabbed the foreman's lighter and stepped out the door. At night, he prepared the kerosene, mounted his Ferrari carriage under the cover of darkness, and hastily drove towards the Boone home, clearly intending to burn it down. However, as he was halfway there, a man holding a hammer in one hand and a bucket in the other stopped him. Just as he tried to take a closer look, the man attacked the Gothic girl's father, slit his throat with a knife, doused him in kerosene, and set him on fire, killing him. Charles was in the midst of shaving when suddenly he felt something in his nose. Gently touching it, a disgusting bug fell out. Alarmed, Charles quickly checked his reflection in the mirror. He felt something wriggling inside his nose again and instinctively reached in to dig it out. After much effort, he finally managed to remove the damned bug. Strangely, however, the wriggling sensation didn't subside. It intensified. Charles, losing control, grabbed his razor and slashed his own nose open. The intense pain suddenly snapped Charles back to reality, and he realized the sensation had stopped. Upon closer inspection, his nose was back to normal, and the sink was spotless. It had all been a hallucination. An unsettling morning didn't faze Charles. He arrived at the town pastor's home and saw a family portrait of the pastor, which included a set of twins. As the pastor came to the door, he informed Charles that his children had tragically passed away. The photo was just a memento. Charles offered his condolences and inquired about the girl standing at the back of the photo. The pastor explained that she was Stephen's daughter. After the pastor's own children had contracted a mysterious illness and died, his wife Alice had directed her resentment towards the Boone family. This was also why Alice's father had driven Charles out and insulted him. After discussing family matters, Charles made a request to the pastor. He wanted to give a business presentation in town with the main goal of setting up a shipyard to invest in the town and recruit workers. The pastor thought this was a good idea and agreed that Charles could participate in the afternoon's Thanksgiving service. The conversation went smoothly, and Charles expressed his gratitude for the pastor's help and apologized for any trouble caused to his family. The pastor, expressionless, stated that none of this had anything to do with the Boone family. The afternoon arrived quickly, and the pastor led Charles into the Thanksgiving service. As soon as Charles appeared, there was a stir among the attendees. With the pastor's persuasion, the crowd reluctantly allowed Charles to speak. After a passionate speech, Charles addressed the town's needs, advocating that building a shipyard would lead to rapid economic development and prosperity. Alice's father immediately opposed Charles, accusing him of trying to drain the town's resources for his own wealth. Charles, not to be outdone, countered that the old man was being obstinate. He urged everyone to let go of their hatred and prejudices against the Boone family, stating that past events had nothing to do with him. His aim was simply to live peacefully and create new wealth with the townspeople. Charles announced that he would be recruiting workers at the local tavern in 3 days, inviting anyone who shared his vision to join the Boone family. On his way back, Charles's Ferrari horse suddenly came to a halt, seemingly wary of something ahead. Looking in the horse's direction, Charles saw a mysterious woman in tattered clothes standing in the middle of the road. Charles asked her if she needed help, but the woman said nothing, took a bite of an apple, and stepped aside. The horse slowly moved on, and as Charles passed, the mysterious woman stood behind him and softly called out, "The worm is calling." Charles knew nothing about its meaning and only left confused. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the town, a pregnant woman was in labor, enduring excruciating pain until finally a cry was heard. The midwife joyfully lifted the newborn, but her smile quickly faded. Sensing something was wrong, the woman asked to see her child. Reluctantly, the midwife handed the baby over. With just one glance, the woman burst into horrified tears, finding that the newborn was deformed, lacking eyes, a mouth, and even limbs. It was a moment of utter despair for an expectant mother. The scene shifts to Alice, arm in arm with her pastor husband, walking down the street. She told the pastor that a single woman had just given birth to a monster, and no one knew who the father was, but she guessed he must be a scoundrel. The pastor, expressionless, listened to Alice's story, his heart tumultuous. Alice could never have imagined that her pastor husband had already strayed from the family. It turns out the woman in labor was the pastor's mistress, and the deformed child was his. That evening, the pastor secretly visited the woman at the inn where she was staying, locked the door, set down his Bible, and tenderly embraced the frightened and wronged woman named Pringle. She was the pastor's mistress. She wept like a giant baby, saying it was all God's punishment. However, the pastor disagreed, holding the deformed baby and smiling, saying it was a blessing from heaven. The pastor told Pringle that they would soon leave the small town and this place of strife. Meanwhile, Rebecca found a public school for the 3 siblings. However, on the first day, as Loa returned to her seat from the blackboard, she was tripped by a boy, scattering her mother's seashell necklace across the floor. The teacher intervened in time, preventing further incident. Loa went home, sadly clutching her seashells, and fell asleep. Strangely, the next day she discovered her necklace was missing. The children were unhappy, and so was Charles. 3 days later, at the entrance of the tavern, Charles conducted recruitment with a notebook in hand. He was focused on growing his business, but overlooked the town residents' stubborn thinking. There were many onlookers, and even more mockers. He faced mockery, but not a single applicant. In the end, Charles hastily concluded the event and returned home, drinking in sorrow. Just as he was lost in his troubles, Rebecca and the armed children came in. Charles asked what they were up to, and the children said it was Halloween and they wanted to go out and have fun in the town. Charles happily agreed. Pringle was in the guest house trying to calm the children when she suddenly saw the mysterious woman downstairs, flexing her stinky feet and staring at her. It was clear that this mysterious woman had her eyes set on Charles, and Pringle as well. Rebecca took Charles and the siblings out to unwind on Halloween night. Unexpectedly, a deranged woman burst onto the street. She was the Gothic girl's mother. It turns out her daughter had just died from illness, and in her grief, upon seeing Charles, she cursed him, claiming his cousin Steven was responsible for the Gothic girl's death. Charles tried to calm her down, but Constable Dennison fired a shot, promptly controlling the situation and ending the Halloween festivity. Back at the old house, the more Charles thought about it, the angrier he got. The unfounded accusations made him suddenly recall the Gothic girl's mother's words. She said his cousin caused the Gothic girl's plague, which was nonsensical and slanderous since Stephen had died before the Gothic girl was even born. Charles drank heavily in his frustration. He went to Stephen's grave, determined to exhume his cousin to confront him about why the Boone family's bad reputation should fall on him and his innocent children. Horrifyingly, when Charles dug up Stephen's grave, he was shocked to find that the coffin was actually empty. Ever since Charles discovered that the graves were empty, he began to suspect that there might be a conspiracy tied to his cousin's inheritance. He revisited Stephen's will and found hints in the letters that suggested some deliberate intent. Charles then went to the former caretaker's residence, and upon inquiry, the caretaker revealed that she was the first to find Stephen's daughter dead in the cellar and Stephen hanging nearby. A few days later, Stephen's father, Philip, overcome by grief, chose to drown himself at sea. The three bodies were displayed in the old house's living room, drawing many curious onlookers, but their interest was not out of respect since the Boone family had a bad reputation. The caretaker hastily buried them. After hearing this, Charles could not believe it was true. He told the caretaker that Stephen's body was not in the coffin and demanded to know why. The caretaker's expression tensed up instantly and said she couldn't tell the truth. Charles knew then that there must be something fishy going on. He boldly speculated that perhaps Stephen's family might not be dead after all. If that were the case, what could their purpose be? Back at home, Charles discussed the possibilities with the governess, Rebecca, but she told him plainly that she had seen the bodies after Stephen's death and was sure they were indeed dead as shit. Just then, a window was smashed. Looking through it, they saw someone causing trouble. Charles grabbed his gun and went outside. The troublemaking crowd, seeing the gun, dared not move. Suddenly, Charles was attacked from behind, recognizing the voice as the foreman's. Due to the significant difference in size, Charles couldn't fight back. In the nick of time, his eldest daughter arrived with a gun, fending off the troublemakers and diffusing the crisis. One of the troublemakers had fallen behind the group. On this sinister night, it seemed like something bad was going to happen, and unsurprisingly, a dark figure approached him and sent the troublemaker to meet Satan. This raises the question, why would the killer eliminate someone threatening Charles? And why was blood always collected in a bucket? The mysteries multiplied, and it seemed that all was not as it seemed. Staring at the photo of Stephen's family of three, Rebecca found the Boone family's story increasingly interesting, being sure that her story writing would be spine-chilling. Because of the previous night's attack, Charles had multiple injuries. Rebecca came over to help treat his wounds, and Charles noticed a bottle of medicine that Stephen used to use. The bottle had an address and a doctor's name on it. After questioning Rebecca, she told him it was a small island. Charles decided to check it out, hoping to find some information about Stephen, and determined to uncover what secrets Stephen held and how exactly they managed to offend the townspeople. No one dared to live on the small island because it was home to an insane asylum. In search of the truth, Charles had to venture to this cruel place. He soon found the doctor, who asked him what brought him there. Charles replied that he was looking for his cousin Stephen. However, the doctor mockingly suggested that he should be searching 6 feet underground, not here. Charles admitted that he had indeed dug up the grave, but found it empty. Surprised, the doctor asked why he did such a thing. Charles explained that he was framed, and he wanted to prove to everyone that Stephen was truly dead. However, the empty grave made him suspect that Stephen might not be dead after all, but was luring him to this town to endure suffering and torment. After hearing Charles's story, the doctor seemed to understand. He told Charles that he was exhibiting classic signs of persecutory delusions, a symptom common in the Boone family. Looking at the medicine bottle in Charles's hand, the doctor explained that it was for treating mania, and he had treated the entire Boone family. Charles found this unbelievable. As he watched the patients being treated, he began to doubt himself. The doctor asked if he saw the worms, which wasn't surprising since it was a characteristic of his family. He named it vermophobia because they had an extreme fear of worms. Charles's father and Stephen's family were driven mad by them, believing a book could cure them, but that book certainly did not exist. There was no cure for their disease. At this moment, Charles was completely overwhelmed. Recalling his own experiences with worms, he realized it was all delusion, a hereditary madness in the family. The doctor advised him to check in for treatment while he was still lucid, for his own sake and his family's. Charles felt his sanity crumbling and hurriedly fled the place. Dragging his weary body back to the old house, his son rushed over to tell him something strange, that the apple he was eating was suddenly crawling with worms. Charles frantically asked if his son was sure they were worms, and his son confirmed it. Filled with despair, Charles realized the cursed family inheritance had reached his own household. He climbed the stairs with a heavy heart, almost tripping over as he glanced at the portraits of his grandmother and Stephen's family. Charles returned to his room and started drinking heavily. Suddenly, strange noises came from the wall again. Already in a dark mood, Charles became instantly agitated and enraged. He wanted to kill the source of the noise immediately. Spotting an axe, he grabbed it and began to swing it wildly. Hearing the commotion, the three siblings rushed to their father's room in a panic. The out-of-control Charles nearly hit Loa with the axe. Reflecting on his behavior, a sobered Charles was frightened by his own actions. Charles went down to the mysterious cellar of the old house, deciding to heed the doctor's advice and use a cold water bath to calm himself. That's when he finally understood why there were shackles on the bathtub. It was meant for emotional control therapy. Like all his family, he had inherited the cursed worm mania. To contain himself, he had to soak in the tub. The bone-chilling ice water made him shiver, but what was more terrifying was seeing a row of familiar words. Blood calls blood. The scene flashes back to the year 1781 in the Boone family mansion, where an elegant lady sipped her tea with grace, flanked by her two sons. Suddenly, she felt unwell. She slowly reached into her mouth and, to her horror, pulled out a disgusting worm. She stared at the wriggling creature in her hand, but her mother's voice snapped her back to reality, and the worm vanished. It was all an illusion. This elegant lady was none other than Charles's grandmother. Fast forward 69 years back to the present time at the small town in Maine. Charles, the sole survivor of the Boone lineage, unexpectedly inherited the old family house. By then, he finally realized the Boone family's fatal history, a madness that could drive one to frenzy and mania. Gazing at his young son, Charles was engulfed in despair. Meanwhile, the pastor's mistress, Pringle, was hanging clothes downstairs when she sensed something was amiss. Turning around, she saw a mysterious woman standing beside to flex her stinky feet. In panic, Pringle drew her dagger, but in the next moment, the woman took the dagger with her own hand and stabbed it into her thigh, declaring she could not escape the deity's control. Watching the mysterious woman leave, Pringle knew she had to flee quickly. The pastor, upon receiving Pringle's message, arrived at the secret meeting cabin. Pringle warned him that it was coming and pleaded with the pastor to quickly take her and her child away. The pastor didn't understand what Pringle meant, but he promised to take her to safety, asking her to wait just a few more days. Returning home, the pastor couldn't find his wife. Alice had run to the graveyard near the church where their stillborn twins were buried. Overwhelmed with guilt, the pastor didn't know how to confess to Alice that he planned to leave the family with Pringle. Words failed him, and he sat down slowly. Alice lamented to him that no matter what was placed on the graves, it would rot, and anything planted would wither. The pastor was heartbroken but felt helpless. He kissed his wife on the forehead and left the graveyard. On the other side, Charles woke up and was found by Rebecca. She decided it was time for a talk, expressing fear that Charles might harm the children. Charles sat down and quietly recounted the nightmares of his childhood, an indelible horror. He felt himself becoming more like his mad father each day. After confirmation from the asylum that day from the doctor, he had no doubt left. He told Rebecca that for the safety of the family, he had decided to go to the asylum for treatment of his madness. Rebecca was at a loss for words, deeply upset. Just then, his eldest daughter burst in, telling Charles they had found something in the barn. They hurried to the barn and were stunned to discover an underground tunnel. Charles instructed everyone to prepare. He needed to investigate. Without hesitation, he descended into the gloomy passageway, crawling to its end where he found a staircase. Climbing it with the aid of an oil lamp, Charles advanced slowly to a dilapidated room. On the wall was written, "Blood calls blood." Leftover bones and decomposed animals littered the floor, signs of recent activity. The room had many exits, leading who knows where, but one thing was certain. It was a secret door, for he realized that on the other side of the wall was the old house, and Rebecca was just a wall away. After emerging from the tunnel, Charles urged Rebecca to quickly return to town. She was to inform the lumberyard's bookkeeper to come for help and to find Constable Dennison for backup. Charles realized it was all a fraud and was determined to expose the great charlatan, Steven. The secrets of the hidden door had precipitated a drastic turn of events, and the deception was laid bare for all to see. The bookkeeper arrived swiftly. Charles was cleaning his gun at the time, telling the details he had discovered in the tunnel. He indicated that Steven was still alive, and Charles was determined to drag him out tonight. The bookkeeper was assigned to protect the three siblings at the old family house, while Charles ventured alone into the tunnel. He settled down in a corner to wait, lying in ambush for Steven's arrival. As night fell, Charles was jolted awake from a nightmare. He got to his feet and began to search for any sign of Steven. It wasn't long before he heard a noise. The sound was coming from near the living room above him. At that moment, Steven was sitting at the top of the stairs. Loa spotted him. Steven, cool as a cucumber, stood up and walked towards Loa. As she backed away slowly, Steven asked her if she liked her necklace. The shell necklace she thought she had lost but had mysteriously gotten back was actually thanks to Steven's behind-the-scenes work. Seeing that Loa had lowered her guard, he told her that if she was willing, she could come with him. Not only could he cure her lameness, but she could also see her dearly missed mother. Just as Loa was about to be beguiled by him, Charles arrived in the nick of time, threatening him to step away from his daughter. But Loa told her father not to shoot. Steven bared his vampire teeth and prepared to escape through the window, but before he fled, he told Charles that he must find that book that could cure the disease. Charles, in a rage, fired a shot, hitting Steven with a fatal wound. Steven fell from the second floor, but he suddenly got up and ran into the darkness without hesitation. Meanwhile, Rebecca rushed to Dennison's house in town late at night. As soon as she entered, she was met with a shocking scene. Dennison's wife was dying in a chair. Suddenly, a figure burst out from behind her. Rebecca quickly gave chase, following the figure to a dead end. However, the moment the person turned around, flexing his pale and vampiric face, she recognized him as Charles's uncle Philip. Dennison happened to be patrolling and arrived just in time. Rebecca told him that Philip was alive and had just attacked Dennison's wife. Hearing this, Dennison hurried back home. Upon returning, Dennison rushed to check on his wife. He found her in a dazed state, extremely weak, with a distinct mark on her neck. Over at Charles's old family home, Rebecca had returned. As everyone was discussing the situation, a group of people suddenly arrived outside the window, led by the mysterious woman, a faithful servant of the deity Jacob. Charles, on guard with his gun at the door, looked out at the ragged crowd and asked the woman what she wanted. The mysterious woman challenged him, saying that if he wanted to know the secrets of the worm and also the history of the Boone family, he should come to Jerusalem's lot. She then sacrificed a young girl right there, a bloody spectacle that sent chills down Charles's spine to his butt. Watching the deranged group depart, Charles was at a loss. The scene shifts back to the Boone family home in the year 1781, when a young passerby witnessed a horrifying sight: 3 people hanging from a large tree. As the young man was about to intervene, he was scolded by a woman who refused help from anyone. Despite the desperate pleas of 2 children, the woman kicked away the stool supporting them. In an instant, the 3 cried out in agony. The young man dashed forward, drew his knife, and began cutting the ropes to save them, one by one, until only the woman remained. When he attempted to save her, he faced resistance. Soon, the woman was dead. The 2 children looked on in horror at their deceased mother, completely forgetting a book on the ground. Dennison, in a daze, came back to his senses, indicating that it was all his memory. It turns out he was the one who had saved Philip and Charles's father years ago. He had come here because of Rebecca's report, but the old family house was now empty. At that moment, he noticed a pool of blood on the floor, indicating that something might have happened to the Boone family. Staring at the vacant home, Dennison couldn't guess where the Boone family had gone. It all started the night before when Steven's veil was lifted. Charles understood that this was a planned conspiracy and deception. He only hoped that his children wouldn't be harmed. However, Loa had clearly been beguiled by something not of this world. The shocking revelations from the mysterious woman about Steven made everything even more confusing. To unravel the mystery, Charles decided to investigate Jerusalem's lot. Before leaving, he entrusted the children to Rebecca, while the bookkeeper accompanied him to their destination. In the small town's church, the pastor faced his wife and finally revealed his affair. Alice asked her husband if he loved his mistress. The pastor remained silent, turned away, and left, leaving Alice heartbroken. The pastor went to Pringle's place, telling her that he couldn't leave yet because he still held the townspeople's confessions in his heart. He wanted to complete their baptisms before going. Pringle argued that the pastor didn't deserve to do this. She spoke of an ancient deity older than God, whose name is Jacob, a bloodthirsty immortal who commands many with great power. The pastor insisted that nothing could exist beyond God. Pringle showed him a bite mark on her thigh as proof, telling him it was made by Jacob and that she too was his servant. After escaping, she met the pastor, but now her whereabouts had been discovered, and she urged the pastor to take her away from this dangerous place immediately. Clearly skeptical, the pastor interrupted her, telling Pringle he had already bought the tickets to leave soon. Meanwhile, Dennison called a doctor after returning home to examine his wife's wound. The doctor told Dennison that the wound didn't appear to be human, but rather animalistic. This revelation plunged Dennison into deep thought. To uncover the truth, Dennison locked his wife behind iron bars for protection and hid in the shadows with a gun. As night fell, Dennison was startled awake and quietly made his way to his wife's bedroom. There, he was shocked to find her sucking the blood from Philip. Philip declared that he was now his and lunged at Dennison, biting him. On the brink of being overwhelmed, Dennison reached for a cross and drove it into Philip's neck. The holy burn pained Philip, who then fled for his shitty life. Dennison looked on at his wife, her mouth covered in diabetic blood with immense sorrow and heartbreak. To solve all the mysteries and ensure his family's safety, Charles and the bookkeeper arrived at Jerusalem's lot. This place was once a prosperous mining area started by his grandfather, but now it was in ruins. Charles sent the bookkeeper back to protect the family while he went ahead alone. He found the residence pale as if drained of blood. Soon he encountered the mysterious woman who guided him into a dimly lit room with a sinister figure seated ahead, and a bloodied woman tied up nearby, with 2 buckets at her feet. The horrifying scene made Charles want to end it quickly. The man sitting there was the so-called deity Jacob. He signaled for Charles to sit down for his long story. Facing the skeletal old man, Charles demanded to know who he was. Jacob claimed he was a necromancer or a vampire leading a cult devoted to an ancient god, the Worm. He told Charles to call him what he wished. Charles couldn't believe his eyes. The existence of vampires was real. He brought a candle closer to Jacob, who gently shielded himself, expressing his preference for the dark. Charles asked about the worms and what had happened to his family. Jacob slowly began to tell the story. It's then revealed that Charles's grandfather once unearthed a dark book here called The Mysteries of the Worm. This book could summon the oldest gods from the darkness, capable of plunging the world into endless night. Charles's grandfather glimpsed the book's power, but in his ignorance, he did not realize that humans could not control it. To avoid the disaster, he sealed his fate by writing his name on the book's last page. From then on, he and his family were cursed by the worms. He gradually lost his sanity, yearning for death's arrival. In a church incident, he even began to devour the living. After his death, Charles's grandmother acquired the dark book, and more eerie events ensued. That is why the townsfolk feared the Boone family, because of their bloody history. Charles listened thoughtfully. He asked Jacob why he had been brought here. Jacob replied that he just wanted the book, but only a member of the Boone family could sense it. Initially, Stephen and his father were to search for the book, but they wanted eternal life in exchange. However, after becoming vampires, they could no longer sense the book. Jacob, infuriated, wanted to kill them, but they pleaded, telling him there was another family member. It's Charles. So Charles was deceived into coming here, all for the sake of helping Jacob find the book in order for him to summon the worm god and release it to the living world. Jacob said that if Charles located it, he and his descendants would be safe from harm and the worm curse would vanish. But it seems that Charles could not easily trust this ghastly creature. At that moment, Jacob had the bookkeeper and a town resident brought in. He killed one on the spot and threatened Charles that he would kill everyone unless Charles agreed to his terms. Just as he was about to kill the bookkeeper, Charles consented to Jacob's demands and agreed to help find the book. Upon returning, Charles discovered a body on the road. Recognizing the familiar figure, he realized it was his daughter, Loa. Everything had been for his children, yet this was the outcome, causing Charles to break down in tears at the sight. He carried Loa's body back to the old house, where everyone watched the sad scene. After laying Loa to rest, Charles closed the door. He leaned over his daughter, looking at the bite marks on her neck, and knew Stephen was to blame. Filled with anger and despair, Charles took to the sea the next day. He wanted to lay Loa to rest in his wife's embrace, perhaps her final wish. Holding his dear daughter, Charles gently kissed her before releasing her into the ocean. The swaying Tesla boat without battery marked the depth of a father's grief. Back home, Rebecca couldn't hide her guilt. She sought out Charles and confessed everything. It's revealed that after Charles had left, Rebecca took the siblings back to their house in the town. That night, Loa accidentally found Rebecca's manuscript and informed her sister. Believing Rebecca untrustworthy, she angrily returned to the old family house where Steven was already waiting. No one knew what happened next. When Rebecca arrived, Loa was gone. It wasn't until Charles returned that they learned of Loa's unfortunate fate. Rebecca was deeply remorseful for not protecting Loa and for keeping the Boone family secrets in her writing. She had indeed betrayed everyone's trust. With nothing left to say, Charles, as evening approached, told Rebecca she could leave after tonight for safety's sake. Ashamed, Rebecca hastily exited the room. That evening, to avoid any mishaps, everyone stayed together. Charles informed the group that Loa's death was a warning from Steven. He believed Steven would come again. At that moment, the door creaked open. It was Loa, resurrected unbelievably. Under everyone's astonished gazes, she called for her father and led him to the barn. Loa was now completely brainwashed by Steven, imploring her father not to resist the illusions of the worms and to find the book quickly, then hand it over to them instead of Jacob. At this point, Charles understood that even if he found the dark book, handing it over to anyone would put himself and his family in danger. In a daze, Steven vanished from sight. Charles hurried after him but found no trace. As he turned around, a multitude of worms had already silently approached. After a troubling encounter with Philip, Dennison called for the pastor and the doctor. They tracked down the former Boone family caretaker who confessed everything under duress. To everyone's astonishment, it became clear that Steven and his kind were the legendary vampires. The so-called plague afflicting the town was the result of people being drained of their blood. Moreover, Dennison learned from his wife that consuming Philip's blood could bring someone back to life after death and grant immortality. She now believed Philip was her god. Dennison's world collapsed at this realization, believing that Philip was not a god but a bloodthirsty monster. Looking at his beloved wife, who had clearly lost her humanity, Dennison waited until she fell asleep before ending her life with a pillow. Having settled his wife's affairs, Dennison picked up a gun. With his loved one killed by his own hands, he saw no hope worth living for. Just as he was about to pull the trigger, his wife resurrected. Meanwhile, the pastor went to meet his mistress Pringle in the church and offered her a train ticket to leave town. He told Pringle that he understood and believed the tales about Jacob, so he decided to protect the townsfolk by eliminating vampire Steven before going after her. Pringle's attempts to dissuade him were futile, and he had no choice but to leave first. When the pastor returned home, he coincidentally encountered his father-in-law caught in an act of infidelity, which naturally led to a severe scolding. With the situation as it was, the pastor had no option but to leave home. Carrying his packed bags, the pastor checked into the guest house run by Rebecca. Meanwhile, Pringle was already holding her child and had boarded a Ferrari carriage leaving town. Midway through the journey, they were stopped by another Tesla carriage that had broken down. Pringle had a bad feeling about this and didn't want the coachman to get out to help, but she couldn't prevent him. As soon as the coachman approached, he was sent to drive in hell. It turns out, the mysterious woman belonging to the vampire cult led a group of followers to ambush them. Pringle thought of fleeing, but was quickly surrounded. She told the mysterious woman that she could accept any punishment, but begged her to spare her child. However, the woman took the child, and with one swift motion, Pringle's life was ended. Turning to Charles, he followed the guidance of the worms and arrived at a certain place. His mind was bombarded with information about the worms. Surrender to them, accept the fear, and only then would he be able to feel their presence. Not sure if it was illusion or reality, Charles began to dig furiously with a shovel until he saw a coffin teeming with worms. It was then he noticed he was at the grave of the pastor's daughter, right beside the church. Brought back to reality, Charles knelt down and pried open the coffin, and among the white bones, he finally found the Book of the Worm Mysteries. Standing slowly, he opened the book and a powerful force swept through him. A terrifying vision appeared. A blood-red sun hung in the sky and the ground was littered with corpses. Jacob was seen walking slowly over the bones, with rivers and seas stained with blood. It was a scene straight out of the apocalypse. Terrified, Charles dropped the evil book and heard Loa's cries in the distance. Picking up the book again, Charles rushed to his daughter. Loa wanted her father to hand over the book, but having just seen a vision of the apocalyptic future, Charles knew the evil book would bring destruction to mankind. He refused his daughter's request. Vampire Steven tried to tempt him, but still he could not persuade Charles. Since they were on holy ground at the church, Steven could only watch, grinding his teeth in frustration as Charles picked up the Book of the Worms and hastily left. At the same time, on Jerusalem's lot, crows filled the sky, an ominous sign that informed Jacob that Charles had found the book and had likely seen a vision of the future. Jacob was certain that Charles would not hand over the book, so he urgently called his servants together. He needed to get to the town immediately to retrieve the Book of the Worms. Charles staggered back to the old family house, and the siblings were relieved to see their father. After comforting the children, he told Rebecca everything and asked her not to leave yet because he was sure Jacob would come for the book tonight, and Stephen wouldn't give up so easily either. In the town, people cast fearful glances as a carriage arrived carrying a body, that of Pringle. When the pastor heard the news, he rushed over and quickly untied the ropes. His helpless cries to Pringle met with no response. Turning to face the crowd, he saw the indifferent faces of the cold-hearted residents. The pastor was devastated. He got out of the carriage and condemned everyone's indifference. His father-in-law took the opportunity to mock and whip the pastor, telling him to get lost. A fight broke out, and the foreman started beating the pastor. Fortunately, Constable Dennison arrived just in time to rescue him and drive the crowd away. The gaze was drawn back to the old family house where everyone was preparing for a siege. Charles entered with a hammer, startling Rebecca, who was engrossed in her work. Clutching the evil book to his chest, Charles claimed he heard weird voices. Sensing his odd behavior, Rebecca sought out the girl to convince her to return to town as her father was acting abnormally. For safety, Rebecca checked the barn for the horses, only to discover Charles had released them. When she asked why, Charles declared no one was allowed to leave, leaving Rebecca frozen in shock. In the room, she found a shovel and went down to the cellar in search of Charles, only to be stunned again by the sight of him preparing a noose. He told Rebecca that he had witnessed the collapse of order from the evil book and that a new world belonged to vampires. He didn't want his children to suffer in servitude. It seemed Charles intended to kill his family, claiming it would save their souls. He finally understood why his father chose to do the same in the past. Facing such terrifying words, Rebecca feigned agreement, then knocked Charles out with the shovel. Charles soon came to and returned to normal. After Rebecca explained everything, he realized he had almost done something foolish, all because of the evil book that had bewitched his mind. He asked where the book was now. Rebecca said she had tied it to Dennison's wife, who was currently bound in the bathtub in the cellar. It turns out Rebecca had called the bookkeeper and Dennison for help, and Dennison had brought his vampiric wife and the pastor. Charles informed them about the book's contents and warned everyone that it must not fall into Jacob's hands, lest darkness descend and humanity face its end. Charles asked the two to stay as a fierce battle loomed that night. Night fell quickly, and everyone was on high alert. Philip arrived first with Stephen and Loa, but the sight of the crosses painted on the old family house deterred them from acting rashly. They shouted from below for the book to be surrendered when suddenly a grappling hook shot down, piercing Philip like a fish snagged from the sea. The group forcefully dragged him upstairs. Amidst the chaos, Dennison was stabbed, and Charles nailed Philip to the wall. Philip's goose roars were cut short by an axe, beheading him ultimately. Below, Stephen anxiously waited until Philip's head rolled to his stinky feet like a bowling ball, revealing his father's demise. As Stephen was about to grieve like a vampire baby, he turned to see Jacob's forces arriving, and after hurling a few harsh words, he fled the old house in a panic. Facing the dense ranks of the vampire army, Charles knew that the battle between humans and vampires tonight was destined to be incredibly tough. Drawing on his experience resisting pirates at sea, Charles detailed everyone's roles. Dennison was stationed by the second-floor window to prevent any intrusion into the barn and the secret passage, while others guarded all the doors and windows on the first floor. He also encouraged everyone that if they stood their ground, they could triumph against the odds. Finally, Dennison asked the pastor to lead a prayer, but the pastor had already begun to doubt God, his faith teetering on the edge of collapse. Seeing the pastor's dilemma, Rebecca led the prayer herself, stabilizing everyone's mood. The vast vampire army approached, and everyone braced for battle. On the eve of the fight, Rebecca comforted the pastor using her words only but not muscles, telling him not to be too upset, as everyone understood his feelings. However, the pastor confessed that he felt the power of the vampires, and although he was a priest, he had never witnessed a miracle from God. He believed God did not exist and called himself a fraud who had deceived himself, his family, and the trust of the townspeople. He felt unworthy of faith or love. Rebecca was deeply concerned about the pastor's state of mind. Before heading upstairs, Dennison went down to the cellar and told his vampiric wife he had avenged her. However, she was indifferent, claiming that the pursuit of immortality and power was humanity's ultimate truth, and that there was no heaven. She even tempted Dennison to drink her blood and become a vampire like her. Dennison, seeing his utterly lost wife, felt a deep sense of helplessness and pain. Meanwhile, Jacob stood at the entrance of the old house, his mere presence causing everyone to breathe heavily. The sight of the millennia-old vampire truly frightened everyone to shit their pants. As Jacob departed, the battle officially began. The first to come in were Jacob's servants, still human and not afraid of crosses. Their main task was to breach the doors. At this moment, the pastor was being seduced by the cult woman outside the window. She told him that his beloved Pringle was nothing more than a prostitute, and he should not sacrifice his life for such a woman. She said that if he handed over the book, he could avoid death. Otherwise, resistance was in vain. The pastor, thinking of his only concern, asked what she had done with his newborn child. The woman revealed that Pringle had never told him the truth about her child, who was not the pastor's son, but the vampire Lord Jacob's. This shocking truth was the last straw for the pastor, who was completely broken. He went to Dennison's wife, intending to take the book and surrender to Jacob, but luckily Charles arrived in time to talk him down with some heartening words, temporarily stabilizing the pastor. Dennison, responsible for guarding the secret passage, ultimately faltered, and the passage leading to the old house began to be exposed. Vampires had already infiltrated. The little boy, isolated and discovered, was saved by someone in a moment of crisis. Moments later, when the door opened, he realized it was his sister Loa, who had turned into a vampire but seemingly not having lost her humanity. With the passage breached, the vampires surged in fearlessly, overpowering everyone as they were forced to retreat. The last door was on the verge of being broken through. Charles instructed everyone to retreat to the cellar, then hurried back himself, managing to close the door at the last moment. This is their last stand, with more and more vampires attempting to break in. In a few minutes more, they might all perish right here. The scent of death hangs heavy in the room. Rebecca leads the children in prayer, while the pastor and Dennison continue to fight valiantly. Meanwhile, Charles points his gun at his children, unwilling to let them become tormented souls of vampires or suffer as the undead. Just as he's about to pull the trigger, the attack from outside ceases. Unexpectedly, the vampire army has retreated. As everyone stands bewildered, the son speaks up. It turns out he's given the book to Loa to save everyone's lives. Charles quickly checks. The book is indeed gone. He rushes outside in pursuit, only to see his little daughter withdrawing with Jacob. All their efforts seem to have been in vain. Frustration and helplessness bring the brave captain to tears. Jacob returns to his lair with his followers and immediately begins the summoning ritual. Before that, he intends to turn all human servants into vampires, so they won't need to act during the day anymore. After the summoning of the worms, the world will become eternally dark. The servants, having drunk blood, go to the woods to commit suicide, awaiting death and their subsequent rebirth. Just before the summoning, Loa asks what will become of her family once darkness descends. Jacob replies that all humans will become livestock, mere food for vampires. Hearing this, Loa feels a ripple of rebellion within her. Back in the small town, Charles, leading the townspeople and accompanied by Dennison's wife, faces the ignorant crowd. Some speak with malice and curses, but when Dennison reveals his wife's true form, the crowd is shocked and fearful. Finding a familiar face was now transformed. She wails as she jumps from the carriage, the sunlight purifying her bloodthirsty nature. Incredulous, the townsfolk watch as Dennison's wife combusts, turning to ash. The horrifying scene makes everyone gasp. The existence of vampires is real. Charles seizes the moment to reveal the truth, explaining that evil vampires were the real cause behind the town's misfortunes over the years. He implores the townspeople to join him in reclaiming the book from Jerusalem's lot, or the world will never see light again. The crowd disperses, leaving Dennison kneeling on the ground, staring at the charred remains of his wife, his heart heavy with sorrow, silently swearing vengeance against Jacob. Alice stopped the pastor, pleading with him to return to their family. However, the pastor had lost all hope in life and was deeply ashamed of his past actions. Alice, holding no grudge, comforted her husband earnestly. Eventually, under Alice's persuasion, the pastor returned home. The pair sat down to share a meal, pouring out their hearts and longing from their time apart. They had many rifts to mend. As they chatted, the pastor suddenly felt unwell. He attempted to stand, but collapsed the next moment. Alice turned the pastor over and asked him once more if he had ever loved her. Then, she spoke her anger aloud to herself, revealing that she had poisoned her own husband. It wasn't long before Charles came looking for the pastor. As he entered, he was met with a desolate scene. He immediately recognized the pastor's lifeless body and saw that Alice had taken her own life as well. Charles then turned to see Alice's father sitting at the stairway, his face wet with tears. The man cried out that Alice was his only family in this world. Charles felt profound sympathy, but in the next instant, Alice's father took his own life with a gun. Under Charles's call to arms, most of the town's men gathered at the tavern to enlist. They convened to plan their strategy. In the town's church, all the elderly women and children took refuge, waiting for the men's return. With everything prepared, the group mounted their horses. Suddenly, Charles sensed that Jacob's summoning ritual was about to begin. The situation was dire. They hurried towards the desolate Jerusalem's lot, where dark clouds roiled, obscuring the sun. At the vampire's lair on Jerusalem's lot, the doors were tightly shut. Inside, the vampire Lord Jacob was opening the ancient book, ready to commence the summoning of the primal worm god. He told all his servants that the book must be read page by page, and the completion of the reading would herald the end of light, to be replaced by a blood sun and eternal darkness for the world. Soon after, Charles and his companions reached Jerusalem's lot, witnessing the soon-to-be extinguished sun. Knowing the ritual was about to start, they lit torches, preparing to set the place ablaze. But they were too late. In an instant, the sky darkened as the sun was completely swallowed by the darkness. The group watched in horror as stars across the cosmos surged towards the darkness, some planets even beginning to crumble and disintegrate. Charles knew that since the blood sun had not yet appeared, there was still time. He instructed everyone to light their torches and prepare for a direct confrontation with the incoming horde of vampires. The battle between humans and vampires was imminent and brutal, with the vampires' numbers growing and the humans being driven back into the surrounding woods. Dennison was gravely injured, and Charles supported him as they took cover. They stealthily made their way to the heart of the lair, spotting a large number of vampires guarding the door. Charles surmised that Jacob must be inside. At that moment, Dennison handed Charles a cross and asked him to kill Jacob to avenge him, expressing his lack of will to live and his profound longing for his wife. He decided to distract the creatures. Amid Dennison's agonizing screams, Charles charged into the lair. After Charles entered the room, he shouted for Jacob to stop the summoning. As the dark ritual neared completion, Jacob, unwilling to halt, ordered Loa to kill Charles. With no other choice, Loa reluctantly advanced towards her father with a dagger in hand. The pained Charles looked at his daughter, trying to awaken her memories, unwilling to harm her. In the end, Loa stabbed, but not Charles. Instead, she killed the cult woman who had been sneaking up from behind. It seemed Loa's humanity was still intact. Charles seized the moment to attack Jacob, but the ancient vampire subdued Charles with one hand. As Loa tried to help, it was to no avail. Jacob, grasping Charles, slowly bit into his neck. In this critical moment, a dark figure snatched the Book of Worms. Surprised, Jacob was caught off guard, allowing Charles to plunge Dennison's cross into his neck. In pain, Jacob retreated backward and, by misfortune, impaled his head on an iron spike sticking out of a wooden stake. Thus, the millennia-old vampire lord met his end. Charles told Loa to hide while he quickly pursued the book. He was certain that the shadow he had seen was indeed his cousin Stephen. At that moment, Stephen stood within the darkness, reciting the final chapter, intending to complete the final ritual on his own. Charles arrived, and without a word, he knocked the book out of Stephen's hands and engaged in a fistfight. They wrestled their muscles, but not tongues, and it was clear that Charles was no match for Stephen. Then, Charles felt a stone within reach, flung it with a backhand motion, and his strength surged. He pinned Stephen down and pummeled him mercilessly. Finally, he picked up a wooden stake and ended Stephen's vampiric life without family mercy. Above, the dark sun continued its ominous presence. Someone picked up the Book of Worms and simply closed it. As the book shut, the darkness gradually began to dissipate. In this setting, Rebecca's smile was one of relief as she looked upon the gruesome battlefield. Charles lit a torch and proceeded to burn down Jacob's lair, taking his little daughter and leaving Jerusalem's lot. He understood that as long as the evil book existed, the creatures of darkness would not rest. After careful consideration, he made a shocking decision to turn himself into a vampire. In doing so, he could not only break the curse, but also guard the evil book. He found Rebecca and shared his plan with her. The days of fighting side by side had led Charles to forgive her, and a mutual affection had begun to form between them. In an uncontrollable moment, they embraced each other but without a hormone yoga session. However, their budding relationship had to be paused. Following Charles's plan, he drank Loa's blood, then had his daughter mortally wound him. Afterwards, the doctor came to surgically implant the Book of Worms inside his abdomen. Then the doctor issued a death certificate, and the bookkeeper dug a grave to create the illusion of his death. From then on, the secret would be hidden, and the world would forget. When Charles awoke, his appearance had completely changed. A new vampire was born. He sat up, looked at the crack in his chest where the book had been sewn in, and everything had progressed smoothly. Slowly descending the stairs, he shared his final wishes and instructed his 3 children to stick together and live well. The next day, he went to the seaside with his family and Rebecca. After bidding farewell to everyone, Charles walked towards the ocean. His son ran over, asking how long his father would be gone. Charles replied that he would always be nearby, protecting them. Then, he pushed the Tesla boat into the water and paddled away manually. As Charles drifted further away, everyone felt an immense sadness. With that, the drama comes to an end. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.